What if your armor didn't save you, but buried you alive? This isn't the story they told in poems or classrooms. This is Agincourt, a battlefield where the mud screamed louder than the men. And in the end, victory came at a price no one ever dared to write down. It was October 24th, 1415. The English were dying. Their bones ached from exhaustion, their bellies gnawed with hunger, and their skin chilled to the marrow by unrelenting rain. King Henry V's army, once 12,000 strong, had been reduced by half, and those who remained were barely standing. Dysentery had run its course like a demon through the ranks, leaving men crouching in the mud, pale and shaking. Their bread was long gone. Their strength? Fading fast. But this wasn't even the battle. No, this was the calm before the storm. The true horror hadn't even begun. The army was camped in a field near the village of Agincourt, France. Across the muddy flats, a very different camp roared to life. The French, flush with wine and confidence, celebrated. Their tents were bursting with roasted meat, laughter and arrogance. After all, they had double the numbers, better training, newer weapons, and hadn't been slogging across France for weeks with nothing but wet socks and infected wounds. If you were French that night, it was the calm before the victory feast. If you were English, it was confession time, because death, real and raw, was coming. In the quiet drizzle, English soldiers lined up in the darkness to whisper their sins to the chaplains. Some knelt in the muck, clutching wooden crosses, eyes clenched shut as they accepted their fate. One account from a French prisoner later described it as a camp already half in the grave, and they weren't wrong. In less than 24 hours, over 6,000 men would be dead. Crushed beneath hooves, impaled by arrows, or suffocated in their own helmets, faces smashed into the slime as more bodies pressed over them like layers of dirt in a human landfill. But how did it come to this? Let's rewind. 2 months earlier, Henry had landed in France with a grand vision. The throne of France, yes, that glittering prize, was his by right, at least according to English claim. France, meanwhile, was in chaos. Their king, Charles II, was known as Charles the Mad, and he earned that title. There are reports that he believed he was made of glass. He had iron rods sewn into his clothing so that he wouldn't shatter. Literally, the kingdom was fractured, a perfect moment for Henry to strike. His plan: start by taking the port town of Harfleur. The English expected a quick victory, but Harfleur dug in. The siege stretched into weeks. Summer turned to autumn. Dysentery exploded. Men died not from blades, but from their own bowels betraying them. By the time the city fell, Henry had lost 5,000 men. But going home? That was political suicide. He'd promised a glorious campaign, not a retreat with nothing to show but funerals and filth. So he did something bold. He didn't wait for reinforcements. Instead, he marched what was left of his army, 7,000 men, across France, through enemy territory, with 2 days' food. He needed to reach Calais, a coastal town under English control. If he made it, he'd prove that he still held power over the region, that the English could walk wherever they pleased. But France wasn't about to just let that happen. Almost immediately, a massive French army began trailing him, twice the size of his. Henry, sticking to his gamble, had left his supply wagons and extra men behind in Harfleur to travel light. Now it was biting him back. Then came the River Somme. Every crossing was destroyed. Every bridge burned. The French had been busy. For days, Henry's forces stumbled along the riverbanks looking for a way to cross. The rain turned fields into sludge. Horses collapsed. Men broke down in tears. And still, no crossing. Food was gone. Hope? That was fading too. Finally, they found a place to cross, but it was too late. The damage had been done. Their muscles ached. Their shoes were rags. The dysentery still crept through their bellies like a thief. And then, the final blow. Scouts brought word. The French army wasn't behind them anymore. It was ahead, blocking the road to Calais, camped just beyond the small village of Agincourt, and So Henry stopped, looked at his men, hungry, dying, shivering, and made his choice. They would not retreat. They would not negotiate. They would stand. They would fight, even if it meant death. It's October 25th, 1415. Dawn. The sky is heavy with clouds, the kind that don't cry gently but scream their grief in torrents. And somewhere between those falling raindrops and the rumble of distant armor, the fate of France's nobility is being sealed in the mud below. The battlefield was narrow, boxed in on both sides by dense forest. If you looked at it from above, it would have resembled a bottleneck, or a trap waiting to be sprung. It was, in every sense, a tactical disaster for any army relying on brute strength and gallant charges. And that, unfortunately for the French, was exactly what they planned to do. At the top of the hill, the French army stretched wide, glinting in polished steel, mounted on war horses that were fed and well rested. Their knights were confident, too confident. They'd seen what they were up against. Half-starved English peasants and bowmen in tattered leathers, archers mostly, not even proper soldiers. Downhill, on the soggy flats, Henry's English forces began arranging themselves in silence. He had a plan, not a grand one, not a glorious one, but a desperate, clever, brutally practical one. He positioned his archers, thousands of them, in a long, shallow curve across the field. And in front of them, they drove sharpened wooden stakes into the ground, angled forward like a field of teeth. These weren't just sticks, they were horse killers. Henry wasn't relying on brute strength. He was relying on psychology, terrain, and physics. In the center, he placed what few men-at-arms he had left, tightly packed, shoulder to shoulder, iron walls of resolve, not armor. The mud was deep, the air hung heavy. Everyone knew. Once this began, there was no stopping it. Then, nothing happened. For hours, both sides stared across the field. Tension stretched like a bowstring. The French, confident in their numbers, waited. Why rush? They had the high ground. Let the English starve a little longer. But Henry couldn't afford to wait. He couldn't outlast the French. His men were already at the edge of collapse. So he made his move. He ordered his archers to pull up their stakes, move forward up the slope into longbow range, and replant them. Once positioned, they knocked their arrows and let loose a sky full of death. The hiss of thousands of arrows slicing through the morning air was followed by an eerie silence. Then came the scream of metal, the cries of wounded horses, and the cacophony of war. The French cavalry had no choice but to charge. They couldn't let their knights sit and get peppered from afar. Down the hill they came. It was thunder at first, majestic, terrifying. The ground shook. Hooves churned the mud into a froth. But then it all began to unravel. The horses hit the arrow storm. Some panicked. Some fell. Riders tumbled, bodies crushed beneath. The survivors pressed forward, only to see the horrifying wall of sharpened stakes emerge from the mist. The horses balked. Some tried to stop. Others swerved. Chaos erupted. Some crashed straight into the stakes impaled. Others turned sideways, smashing into the cavalry still coming behind them. The hill became a rolling wave of confusion, metal smashing metal, flesh smashing flesh. The momentum of the charge collapsed. What was supposed to be a devastating strike turned into a grotesque traffic jam of bodies and blood. Henry's archers did not stop. They kept loosing arrow after arrow into the flailing mass. Every volley was thunder. French commanders watched in horror as their elite cavalry was reduced to screaming wreckage. In desperation, the French adapted. They ordered their infantry to dismount and attack on foot, marching through the mire toward the English line. This was not gallantry. It was a death sentence. The ground, already soaked by the night's rain and now churned by hooves and corpses, became a quagmire. The heavy armor of the French knights, which once made them gods on horseback, now dragged them under. One soldier later described it as like walking through a soup made of iron and sorrow. They couldn't move. Some sank ankle-deep, others to their knees. They tried to push forward, but with each step they were pelted by arrows. Not dozens, thousands. Each one hit with the force of a small hammer. Their helmets rang like bells. Some fell, gasping, their lungs compressed by the weight of mud and steel. Still, some reached the English line, and when they did, it wasn't elegance or formality that greeted them. It was cudgels, axes, mallets. The English weren't fighting like knights. They were fighting like butchers, and they had no choice. They were fighting for life itself. King Henry himself entered the melee. Yes, the king, bashing his way through the scrum to save one of his men, covered in blood, swinging a mace. This wasn't the fantasy of chivalry. This was war in its ugliest truth. By now, the French had lost control entirely. More waves pressed down the hill, but the hill was now a graveyard. Those behind trampled the dying in front. The field turned from a battle into a crush. Knights suffocated, armor locking around their chests like coffins. Those who fell could not rise, and those still standing could barely swing their weapons, pinned on all sides by friends and foes alike. And still, the English archers rained down death until they ran out of arrows. Then they dropped their bows, grabbed clubs and hatchets, and ran in. And because they wore no armor, they danced circles around the bloated knights, quick, nimble, savage. This wasn't a battle anymore. It was a slaughter. By now, the French nobility wasn't just losing the battle. They were being humiliated by physics, rain, and stakes sharpened by starving Englishmen. Wave after wave had poured down that hill, and it didn't matter. Each new charge only added to the chaos. The battlefield, narrow, muddy, and flanked by trees, had become a death funnel. And the longer the French tried to push through it, the worse it got, because the French didn't just fall back. They fell into each other, into the mud, into the screaming, dying pile of men already choking on their own armor. By midday, the battle was no longer a clash between two armies. It was a slow-motion catastrophe. It started with the infantry. Men in steel suits, too heavy to move quickly, sank with every step. The field, ripped apart by hooves and boots, became soup. Their footwork faltered, they slipped, they stumbled. They collapsed, and they couldn't get back up. Picture this. A knight falls forward in his plate armor. The weight presses his chest to the ground. There's no handhold to push himself up. The mud fills his helmet. He begins to choke. His lungs heave against the pressure. He flails, but he's stuck. And the men behind him, unaware or uncaring, keep marching forward. They trample him. This happened over and over again. And the pressure. Oh, the pressure. Men were pressed so tightly together that they couldn't swing their arms. Some couldn't even breathe. Their own comrades crushed them from behind. Bodies slid, plates locked together, blades couldn't be drawn. It wasn't a fight. It was suffocation in armor. As the crush deepened, panic spread. Those on the flanks tried to escape by moving inward toward the center, away from the English arrows. But all they did was shove more men into the meat grinder. One French knight later wrote in his chronicle, "We became the weight that drowned each other." And the English? They watched. Then they advanced. At this point, Henry's archers had exhausted their arrows. But they didn't retreat. They dropped their bows, picked up hatchets, maces, hammers, anything that could be swung hard and fast. Unlike the French, these archers were mobile. They wore little to no armor. They weaved between the knights, targeting exposed joints, faces, necks. It was like watching wolves descend on armored bulls stuck in quicksand. They smashed teeth, cracked skulls, sliced throats, and they kept going. They didn't need precision. They just needed force. And when you're swinging a cudgel into a man who can't lift his shield, well, you can imagine what happens. By now, the English line had moved forward. Even Henry himself was in the thick of it, his helmet dented, his sword soaked. This was no longer about tactics. It was survival. The archers were merciless because they had no choice. They had been starving, sick, taunted by death for weeks. And now, finally, they had the advantage. They weren't going to waste it. The French, however, didn't realize how deep they were in it. More men kept coming down the hill, more nobles, more knights, as if sheer courage could win the day. But what they ran into wasn't just a battlefield anymore. It was a swamp of limbs, bodies, and shattered pride. Those further back began slipping down the incline. They couldn't stop. They crashed into the tangle of men ahead of them. The pressure built, and those in the middle? They screamed. Men were pinned. Some couldn't raise their arms above their heads. Others had their faces smashed into the backs of their comrades. Then the armor began to betray them. Convex chest plates designed to deflect swords were caved in by blunt strikes. The metal didn't break. It compressed. Slowly. Crushing the ribs. Collapsing lungs. Turning the armor into a coffin. Soldiers weren't just dying. They were being crushed, suffocated, smothered, buried alive under their own brothers in arms. Blood ran like gutters through the field. Not trickling, flowing. And then the unthinkable happened. Some French soldiers tried to surrender. They threw down weapons, raised their arms. Some even screamed the word, pitié. And Henry initially accepted dozens, maybe hundreds, of prisoners were taken. But then came a sound, a terrible sound. A shout from the rear of the English lines. The French, it was said, were regrouping. There was word of a counterattack. Some feared that if the prisoners were left alive, they might rise up, take weapons, and overwhelm the exhausted English forces from within. Henry made a choice. One of the darkest of his career. He ordered the slaughter of the prisoners. It shocked even his own men. Some refused. Chroniclers say that lower-ranking soldiers hesitated, horrified at the thought of murdering unarmed men who had already begged for their lives. But others obeyed. Men were dragged into circles, their throats cut, their skulls caved in with hammers. There was no time, no ceremony, just blood. To this day, historians debate why Henry gave the order. Some argue it was tactical, a cold-blooded necessity to protect the English rear. Others say it was psychological warfare, and some believe it was simply fear. Raw, unfiltered fear of being overwhelmed when they were so close to winning. Whatever the reason, it happened. And with that, the battle ended in blood and silence. The French lines collapsed. Those who survived fled. And the battlefield, which had once echoed with boasts and war cries, now echoed only with groans, sobs, and the distant caws of crows. When the sun finally broke through the clouds on October 25, 1415, it did not shine on glory. It illuminated a swamp of broken armor, twisted limbs, and silence so heavy it almost crushed the air itself. The Battle of Agincourt was over, and the field looked more like a mass grave than a battlefield. The numbers told the tale. The English had lost somewhere around 600 men. The French? At least 6,000 were dead. Some estimates say more, most of them knights, most of them nobles. The cream of French chivalry, extinguished in a single muddy morning. Whole families were erased from history. Some noble lineages that had lasted generations ended in a single afternoon. Their heirs drowned face down in the muck, their swords still sheathed. In one chilling account, a squire wrote that you could walk from one end of the battlefield to the other without ever stepping on grass. Only corpses. But the real horror wasn't the body count. It was the realization that all of it had been for nothing. There was no strategic gain, no great treasure won, no castles captured. It was ultimately a massacre born of pride, hunger, and desperation. Henry V had proven that he could win, that even with half an army, no supplies, and a string of bad luck, he could still shatter the enemy. He would return to England as a hero. Crowds would roar, church bells would ring, songs would be sung about the mighty Longbowmen who defied the odds. But standing there ankle-deep in the blood-soaked dirt, you would not have seen victory. You would have seen eyes frozen wide in terror, mouths filled with earth, armor split, open like fruit. Henry was king. But no one walks through a day like that unchanged. His men were shaken. His chaplains worked day and night after the battle to absolve those who had executed prisoners. Some cried, some couldn't stop vomiting, some never spoke of it again. A silent understanding crept into the soul of every survivor. This wasn't a legend. This was a nightmare, and yet the consequences reached far beyond the battlefield. France was now vulnerable. Their king, Charles VI, was still alive, but barely sane. His council was divided. His army had been gutted, and with so many nobles dead, entire regions of the country suddenly found themselves without leadership. This left Henry in a position of terrifying strength. He used it. Not with more battles. Not immediately, but with diplomacy sharpened by blood. The French, desperate to stop the bleeding, agreed to negotiate. Years later, in the Treaty of Troyes, Charles VI named Henry as the heir to the French throne. It should have been the moment England achieved what no English king had ever managed, to unite the crowns of England and France under one ruler. But fate, cruel as ever, had other plans. Henry would never live to wear that second crown. He died just a few years later, likely of dysentery, the same disease that had ravaged his men on the road to Agincourt. The irony is so thick, it almost bleeds. His infant son Henry VI would inherit the English throne, and the impossible promise of a French one. But a baby cannot hold two kingdoms together. And soon, everything would unravel. The 100 Years' War would grind on. France would rally. England would fracture. And eventually, all that Henry had won with blood would slip through his dynasty's fingers like sand. Agincourt, in the end, did not change the outcome of the war. It simply delayed it. But it changed everything else. It destroyed the myth of chivalry. The idea of noblemen riding into battle with honor and ceremony was trampled into the same mud where their horses collapsed. This was not the age of knights and banners. This was the age of arrows, mud, disease, and desperation, and it reminded the world that war is not fought in poems and paintings, it is fought in filth. In silence, in screams, Agincourt gave Henry V his legend, but it cost Europe its illusions. To the English, it was a miracle, a story of God's favor, of national pride, of divine justice. To the French, it was a nightmare, an open wound, a memory, soaked in shame. And to history, it remains a haunting symbol of how quickly the proud can fall, how brutally war strips away humanity, and how the ground itself remembers what kings forget. Even now, visitors to the field at Agincourt report an eerie stillness. Some say it's just the wind through the trees, others aren't so sure. If there was ever a moment when the ideals of medieval knighthood gasped their final breath, it was Agincourt. Not in some grand symbolic flourish, but in the sucking sound of mud filling lungs, in the crack of skulls split open by peasants wielding hammers, in the stunned silence of 1,000 noblemen trampled under their own pride. This was not just the end of a battle. It was the end of an era. For centuries, European warfare had been wrapped in ritual. Heralds announcing combat, duels for honor, chains of command respected like divine order. But here, at Agincourt, there were no rules left. What took place on that blood-drenched field was a brutal preview of the wars to come. Wars of attrition, of firepower, of overwhelming force smashing chivalry into dust, because Agincourt wasn't won with honor. It was won with disease, fatigue, terrain, and innovation. The English longbowmen were not knights. They weren't even noble. They were village boys, sons of farmers, many of them barefoot. But their skill with the bow made them lethal. Their arrows didn't ask for lineage. They didn't care about titles. They tore through plate armor, toppled war horses, and ended dynasties. The power dynamic on that field was flipped entirely. The elites, dressed in the finest armor money could buy, were reduced to targets. And the poor, forgotten men with string and wood, carved their names into history. This was a terrifying revelation for the ruling classes. If low-born archers could destroy the most powerful nobles in France, what else could they do? The fear, wasn't just about arrows. It was about what came next, because after Agincourt no army could afford to ignore the common soldier. The future of war would belong not to knights with silk-lined lances, but to men who could march long, shoot fast, and kill without blinking. Even the terrain itself, the narrow, muddy field, became a weapon. Henry had turned geography into a general. He didn't outfight the French. He outthought them. And in doing so, he set a precedent that echoes to this day. We remember Agincourt because it was improbable. A sick, starving army beat a force twice its size. A young king risked everything and won. The noble dead became a legend. The common living became ghosts. But behind all the poetry lies something darker and more honest. The truth is that thousands of men died for nothing more than a power play. The truth is that Henry never got his French crown. The truth is that most of the men who survived returned home broken, diseased, or forgotten. History is often told by the victors, but the mud of Agincourt still holds the story of the fallen. And what's most tragic is that we've learned so little from it. Even centuries later, we still wage wars for crowns. Still send the young to fight the battles the old designed. Still pretend that there's glory in blood instead of grief. Agincourt is studied in war colleges, immortalized in Shakespeare, and etched into the British psyche as a symbol of national grit. But it should also be remembered for what it truly was: a horror story, a cautionary tale, a field where ideals drowned in the rain. As we look back at that battlefield, now peaceful, now green, it's easy to forget what happened there. But maybe that's the most dangerous part of all, forgetting, because when we forget what war truly is, we romanticize it, we repeat it, we rewrite it. Agincourt should never be rewritten. It should be remembered in full. The mud, the fear, the screams, the silence. It should be remembered not for the crown it nearly delivered, but for the lives it certainly destroyed. The names carved in monuments tell only part of the tale. The rest is still buried beneath the French soil, still waiting to be heard, still whispering to those who walk the field and listen closely.